The heavy oak doors of King Charles III's private study groaned open with an air of solemn ceremony, their ancient hinges protesting faintly as Prince Harry swept into the book-lined inner sanctum. His face was a mask of anguish, cheeks streaked with the glistening trails of fresh tears. Without preamble, the Duke of Sussex dropped heavily into the tufted leather chair stationed across from his father's imposing oak desk. For long, tense moments, a strained silence descended over the room, hanging thick and oppressive between the two men as they regarded each other across the polished expanse, the young Prince Raleigh distraught, the aging monarch's expression an inscrutable tapestry of mingled emotions. Finally, after mustering what feeble reserves of composure he could, Harry spoke in a voice rendered hoarse and unsteady from the exertions of muffled sobs. I can't even begin to fathom what possessed you to take such extreme action," he choked out, each word laden with a freight of wounded accusation. "To go to those lengths, to make such an irreversible decision without even consulting me first." Charles regarded his younger son with an implacable solemnity, his proud jaw tensing almost imperceptibly before he delivered his measured response. "You'd be wise to choose your next words with great care, Harry," the king intoned, his baritone thrumming with the unmistakable timbre of royal authority. "What's done is done, and bitter recriminations will avail you nothing now." This was a necessity born of regrettable but unavoidable circumstances. The crestfallen prince wilted visibly at the rebuke, crumpling in further on himself with shoulders slumped in abject resignation. "I don't know how you could ever expect me to accept that, or to pretend I'll simply move on from this as if it's inconsequential." Only then did Charles's stoic facade flicker with an errant ghost of paternal empathy, the icy mask briefly fracturing to reveal a fleeting glimpse of the profound sadness lurking within. It vanished in an instant, however, subsumed once more beneath the weighty mantle of the monarch's duty-bound impassivity. "You're my son, Harry," he said, more gently now. "I'll always love you as such. But I have obligations that transcend even the most sacred of filial bonds, burdens that come with the crown I never asked to inherit but must shoulder with unflinching resolve." Those words triggered a fresh paroxysm of distress in the prince. He bowed his head, gripping the plush arms of his chair until his knuckles shone bone-white as he fought to regain mastery over his roiling emotions. "You've severed me from the very identity, the very heritage that's defined me since birth." Harry erupted, his anguished shout hanging like a concussive shockwave in the hushed air. All for what? Some nebulous, self-important notions about kingly duty and obligation? It was only then, with his son's pent-up torment finally laid bare, that Charles's unflappable facade faltered. For the barest instant, the mask of the indomitable sovereign slipped aside, allowing Harry a fleeting glimpse of the haunted, exhausted father beneath, the visage of a man bearing burdens far too immense for a single set of shoulders. Their eyes met across that immeasurable gulf of anguish, of hurt and disappointment unspoken. Charles sank back into his arched chair, suddenly aging decades before his son's eyes as he sagged with the enormity of all he'd been forced to accept, all he'd been duty-bound to sacrifice. "Do you recall the investiture at Carnarvon Castle?" the king asked, his voice a near whisper now, devoid of judgment or bitterness. "What I told you in the shadow of those ancient battlements when you asked why I was being made to undertake all those rituals and oaths?" Harry nodded almost imperceptibly, struck mute by the rawness of his father's unguarded vulnerability. "I told you that one day, the enormity of it all would become clearer," Charles continued. "That there are different forms of duty, and that mine could never be escaped no matter how unpalatable the cost." A tinge of hoarseness crept into his even tone as the elder man continued. "This latest measure I felt compelled to take, it was among the most wrenching, most shattering decrees I've ever had to enact as monarch. Believe me when I say it carves out a piece of my very soul." Tears glimmered unspent in the corners of Charles's eyes as he gathered the last vestiges of his implacable royal resolve. But the monarchy's ancient obligations must be upheld, no matter how painful, how unjust the sacrifices demand. "This is the burden I bear, Harry, a mantle you may never fully comprehend until you've worn the crown yourself." In that suspended moment, two very different men regarded each other across a chasm of silence and loss and sacrifice. On one side, a son reeling from the agony of an identity shattered, the ancestral legacy he'd been groomed to uphold his entire life cruelly revoked without warning or explanation. On the other, a weary monarch confronting the most excruciating of his kingly duties, severing the very bonds of tradition and heritage that had sustained his line for generations. Harry was the first to turn away, throat clenched against the maelstrom of emotions battering his insides. He strode to the study's arched window, staring out sightlessly across the impeccably tended palace grounds, before finally summoning the tremulous words that could never express the magnitude of his devastation. "I don't accept this, Father," he murmured in a voice drained of all inflection, every syllable weighted with the gravitas of unshakable conviction. "I may never be able to accept it." He turned then, raw anguish etched into the taut lines of his features. "And I may never forgive you for it." Even as Harry swept from the room in a torrent of bitterness and anguish, Charles remained unmoving, his gaze a thousand-yard stare of sorrow and resignation. Outside the palace gates, a growing assemblage of reporters and royal watchers jockeyed for position, feverishly trading in hushed rumors about what world-shaking event could have unfolded behind those ancient, tightly guarded castle walls. With every passing second, the king remained inert, statue-like, as though frozen in the dull amber of tragedy, a woebegone figure dwarfed by the immensity of his own immutable fate, the monarchy's crushing obligations finally robbing him of the last tattered vestiges of happiness and peace. Drifting on the still evening air came the muffled strains of his son's convulsive sobbing, each ragged exhalation of grief lacerating the last remnants of Charles's impassive public mask. As the sun sank in buttery streaks of orange and pink beyond the palace turrets, the monarch finally succumbed to his own silent tears, his soul riven by heartrending isolation no crown or kingdom could ever ease. The frenzied rumor mill churned at the full fever pitch of speculative overdrive following Prince Harry's tear-stained exit from King Charles's palace chambers. In the hours and days that followed, salacious snippets of gossip began leaking from every nook and cranny of the royal sphere to be instantly weaponized by the sensationalist media machine. Was the House of Windsor teetering under the weight of a momentous constitutional crisis? Had salacious indiscretions or scandals finally bubbled to the surface after decades of suppression? Perhaps the febrile seeds of a full-blown abdication, or even a potential coup, were gestating behind the imposing Bachwork walls of the monarchy's fortified bastion. The breathless speculation eventually detonated into outright frenzy when surreptitiously recorded snippets of Harry and Charles's wrenching confrontation began circulating courtesy of some unidentified royal mole. The bombshell leaks, smuggled to the voracious media via anonymous digital Dropbox, offered tantalizing hints at the true nature of their cataclysmic rupture. "Severed me from the very identity, the very heritage that's defined me since birth," came Harry's unmistakable, anguished timbre. And in his father's sorrowful baritone, "This latest measure I felt compelled to take, it was among the most wrenching, most shattering decrees I've ever had."